It is August 13th, 1932, Berlin. I welcome Timothy Ryback. He's the author of a new book, Takeover, Hitler's Final Rise to Power. Tim is the co-founder and director of the Institute for Historical Justice and Reconciliation at The Hague. He speaks to me from Berlin itself, and we're speaking of moments between August 13th, 1932 and January 30th, 1933, in which everything changes for Germany, for Europe, and I will say for the century, the 20th century, and it's still underway, the transformation of the maps and of loyalties these many decades. Tim, a very good evening to you. Thank you very much. At that date, the Dow, you report, is at 41.22, its lowest ever. Berlin is clear, a clear sky that day. And meeting, importantly, are two men whose fate will be intertwined forever. One is Paul von Hindenburg, the 84-year-old statuesque German military man who's become the president of the Reich, giving him constitutional power to name and unnamed governments, to name and unnamed chancellors. He's being introduced to a man, Adolf Hitler, who believes he's about to be the new chancellor of Germany. And he says to Hitler at one point, without sitting down, "Are you personally willing to place yourself at my disposal for participating in the government?" ? To which Adolf Hitler answers, "Nein." Please interpret that sentence and that scene. Why is Hitler there? Why is Hindenburg offering him participation in the government? Why the nine? Good evening to you.
Good evening, John. Thank you very much. Well, I think we know enough about Adolf Hitler to know what kind of man he was, and he was an all or nothing man. And the critical term there was to participate in the government. Hitler was not a coalition man. He was not he was an all or nothing man. And if he was going to be given a role in the government, it was going to be the key role, and he would be the man in charge of the government.
Did Hindenburg know that when he made that construction, that this would lead to Hitler rejecting it, or did he think he was charming him in some fashion?
I think, Hindenburg had met with Hitler on several previous occasions. The first time Hitler came in, they had a meeting, and Hitler lectured, as you said, this relatively young Austrian, this 40-something Austrian, lectured for 45 minutes, this iconic 80-something leader of Germany. And after the meeting, Hitler walked out, and Hindenburg said, "Who was that man?" And he said, "I never bring someone like that to me again." They then did have several subsequent meetings. So the two men had known each other. There was a certain amount of sparring involved, but Hindenburg did not like Hitler for many, many reasons. First of all, because of most important, I think, because of Hitler's divisive politics. Hindenburg saw himself as somebody who was above the day-to-day political sparring and bickering and fighting, there to unify Germany, the German people as a nation. And he saw Hitler as a very disruptive and divisive figure. You also had to bring in the fact that, Hindenburg was this Prussian aristocrat, entitled, ennobled, and also a grand figure. Hitler had never made it beyond the position of corporal during his 4 years in the army. And on top of that was Austrian to boot. He wasn't even quote unquote German. And famously Hindenburg referred to him as that Bohemian corporal. And so I think the tensions between the two men were always there. This is an occasion for Hitler and Hindenburg to meet. Hitler had just I should say the National Socialists had just done very well in the elections. They had gotten 37% of the electorate, making them by far the most powerful political force in the country. Traditionally, historically, the party with the largest percentage in this multi-party system would get the chancellorship position and then be allowed to form a government. I think Hitler's expectation was that he was entitled, given that they'd won this 37%, Hitler was entitled to the chancellorship, and he basically went in there expecting it. His math on this was interesting, which was basically, and this is typical Hitler, he argued that 37% was 75% of 51%, meaning he had the majority of a simple majority and therefore should be given all power. So when Hindenburg says to him, "Are you willing to cooperate in a government?" Hitler gave that very clear answer, 9.
Tim makes a very careful presentation, important to repeat. This is Hitler at the beginning of his climb to power. He never has a 50% majority of the German people. He is not voted into office. That is the story Tim's telling in Takeover. This is about the manipulation of all the players, and we're going to meet them all in the course of this conversation. This is before they're monsters, before they're dictators, before they have command of something called the Wehrmacht, before they attack Europe, which is usually how we meet Hitler and Goebbels and Himmler, and even Röhm, the man who dies in the light of Night of the Long Knives. We meet them as fully blown monsters, not here. And Tim, you mentioned the previous election, the one that the momentum Hitler is citing all the time about how I started in a room in 1919 with 7 other people, and now I've got it, and then he fills in the blank, millions here, millions there. In the previous elections, he had 12 delegates who were NSDAP, that is the German acronym for what we call National Socialists. Then he had 107 members, and then they climbed to 230, which is the July 31st, 1932 election. He wants a majority, and he believes that he deserves the majority. Hindenburg knows this, so does everybody around here. What is it that holds Hindenburg back from offering him the chancellorship, the opportunity to form a coalition? Is it Hitler's insistence that I will have total control? Is that why Hindenburg hesitates?
Hindenburg hesitates, because first of all, no one is going to tell Hindenburg what to do or not to do. Hindenburg has the Article 53 power to appoint or dismiss chancellors at will. And I think he, first of all, will not be dictated to, even especially by this, 40-something-year-old Bohemian corporal. But mostly what Hindenburg bothers him most about this is, as I mentioned, this divisive politics that Hitler is driving toward. Now, Hindenburg is conservative, but he's a centrist conservative, and he's looking to build a centrist conservative coalition, first of all, to keep the Bolsheviks at bay. And there was a serious communist threat to the Weimar Republic at the time, but equally so to keep the right-wing radicals like the Nazis also at bay. And Hindenburg was just trying to shore up a conservative center to move the country forward. He did not see Hitler as the man who was capable of doing that and was simply not willing to appoint him. There's a famous anecdote from that summer that Hindenburg allegedly said that if he were to give Hitler any position, it would be as postmaster general, so he could lick me from behind on my stamps. There's a wonderful cartoon in one of the newspapers that shows Hitler's titled, Post Onkel Hitler, sort of Postman Hitler, showing Hitler there in a postman's uniform, juggling a bunch of letters in his hands.
That evening, Hitler huddles with his team, and the quote that Tim provides us, Hitler explains to his team why he didn't accept to be a member of the coalition. I would rather besiege a fortress than be a prisoner in one. We're going to turn to who are the important people to follow as this drama from August of 32 to January of 33. We can't change history. So we're going to repeat very carefully the steps that Hitler takes to make himself dictator. The book is Takeover, Hitler's Final Rise to Power. Timothy Ryback is the author. This is August 32 to January 33. The players. We begin with Hitler's side of the fence. Hitler, we know, a man named Gregor Strasser, whom has put together the NSDAP, carefully managed it like a managing editor manages a newspaper. What do we need to know about Strasser at this moment? He's not in the room with Hitler when he's being challenged by Hindenburg. Why not, and where is he now?
Well, Gregor Strasser, you mentioned the name of the party is the National Socialist Workers' Party. And there's those two words are key. One is nationalist and the other is socialist. Hitler and Strasser were basically kind of yin and yang. Hitler was the fanatic nationalist. Strasser was the committed socialist. He really was pushing a national but a socialist agenda, meaning he was a man of the people. He was this easygoing, gregarious guy. He was a coalition builder. He was a baby holder, a baby kisser. He would sit with people and drink beer. He just had a working man's kind of appeal that Hitler never did. There was, Hitler, for all of his charisma, was a distant figure. He was inaccessible. And Strasser was, as they say, more of a gregarious, easygoing type. But Hitler needed him as much as Strasser needed Hitler. So he was absolutely key to building the National Socialist Party. Hitler had basically, there came a point as the party was growing where Hitler ended up running the southern part of the country, and Gregor Strasser, with his brother, developed the party in the north of the country and was really a key force in organizing and turning the Nazi party into a national, not only a movement, but a national political force with a real political organization.
On the Hindenburg side of the fence, we have the Minister of Defense, von Schleicher, and we have the Chancellor, Papen. What do we need to know about Schleicher and Papen?
Well, Schleicher, the New York Times correspondent called Schleicher, the key power broker in all of Berlin. He said anything that was happening in German politics, in German power politics, Schleicher was behind it. His formal position was that of Minister of Defense, but in a turn around to the Clausewitzian phrase, war is politics by other means. Schleicher really saw war as, or politics as war as politics by other means, and really was a political strategist as much as anything. Papen was your typical German aristocrat, He was a handsome, good-looking guy, statuesque, perfect to present, but allegedly was not a terribly bright bulb and was very much seen as Schleicher's political puppet. Schleicher used to refer to, Schleicher as Papen as kind of his head was not used for carrying brains, but rather a top hat.
On Hitler's side, we have Röhm, head of the SA. What is the SA at this point?
The SA started out, as we all know, as sort of these stormtroopers, these basically beer hall ruffians who were then eventually formed into an army of about 400, or 400-man private army. They were the brown shirts, who would march through the streets, confronting the communists, fighting them in these pitched battles. But we're also there to collect funds for the Nazi Party. And they were stand on street corners with tin cups, collecting things and promoting the Hitler movement.
And it's important, Tim, to say they were matched by the Iron Brigade and the Steel Helmets, and they were representation of other parties, but that there was a militarization of the street in Germany because of its sense of inferiority or weakness, or because the limits of the Reichswehr. I don't remember why they were permitted these military political parties. We have less than 30 seconds. Was there an explanation? Why did Hindenburg permit it?
Well, you had immediately after the World War I, when the German army was restricted, there was a serious communist threat. You had the rise of what were called Free Corps, these Freikorps, and out of that grew these militarized units of various for each political party.
So the streets were filled with men in different uniforms who were murdering each other. The death toll is, Tim recounts it throughout the course of these months. We're going to turn now to the Reichstag and its dissolution. Timothy Ryback is here. Takeover is his book, Hitler's Final Rise to Power. It is August 30th, 1932. Hitler has refused to join a coalition. The Reichstag's still meeting. A man named Papen is the chancellor, but the Reichstag is destined to be dissolved. Remember, Hindenburg has the power to appoint chancellors and to dissolve the Reichstag, and also to be a dictator, a one-man rule in between if he wishes. But it's important to understand that Hindenburg has been in office a long time now. They asked him to stay after his first term, and he stood against Hitler in the spring of 32 and won by 5 million votes. He's extremely popular. But he no longer goes to the office much. He stays in his family grounds in Neubeck, which is on the other end in Prussia, away from Berlin. Berlin is the capital of Prussia. It's the capital of Germany at this time. And on August 30th, he's not at the Reichstag in Berlin. He's meeting with his lieutenants at his ancestral home. At the Reichstag, however, there's drama underway. Not least because there is no majority. And Tim, without a majority, the Reichstag is aware that it can't rule the country, that it can't pass any legislation. You have a list of how many times Hindenburg has had to use his power under the 48th article of the Constitution to issue an order because the Reichstag can't resolve anything. What is the general opinion at this point of Germany, of the Reichstag? That it's unnecessary, that it's broken, that it can be fixed, that democracy is ungainly? We know Hitler hates democracy and wants to destroy it, and has said he'll destroy it with its own weapons. What is the general opinion in Germany of how democracy is working after replacing the monarchy?
Well, actually, for all the flaws of the Weimar Constitution, the Reichstag basically functioned fairly well for the first 12 years. I mean, they They passed laws. There's the crazy inflation. In 1924, you have the market crash in 1929. You have all these financial strains. You have a lot of social tension, political unrest. But the Reichstag, as a functioning um, structure for the democratic process, worked fairly well. What happened was when Hindenburg refused to appoint Hitler as chancellor, because Hitler was all or nothing, he said, okay, well, if I can't be chancellor, I'm going to break the system, the legislative system, and I'll play obstructionist politics. Now they had 37% of the votes, 230 seats out of the 600 plus seats in the Reichstag. And without the Nazis agreeing to vote on legislation, nothing could go through. So they basically decided to gridlock and paralyze the legislative process.
And the idea was to break it then. This was active, it wasn't passive.
Yeah,
And,
because oh, sorry.
no, please.
Oh, yeah, I was going to say is Joseph Goebbels, who was one of Hitler's first delegates in the Reichstag, said explicitly, the sort of the funniest thing or the craziest thing about democracy is that they give its mortal enemies the tools to its own destruction. And so the National Socialists saw when they got into the Reichstag, they did not come in, as Goebbels said, we don't come as friends, we don't come as neutrals, we come as your mortal enemies. And they entered the house with the intention of burning it down.
There are competing parties present at this moment. There's the German, let me see if I get them all right. There's the NSDAP, the National Socialists. There's the German Nationalists. There's the Center Party. There's the German parties. My notes is scrambled here. There's several competing forces, and they don't.
The Social Democrats were a major force, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then there are the communists, and they're all negotiating with each other all the time in a confrontational fashion. It doesn't look like anybody wants to work with anybody else. I understand that. It's familiar in democracy, and that's a frustration. And so they're going through this motion of organizing the Reichstag on August 30th. And do they know at this time that they're going to be dissolved because they can't form a coalition? They have a certain amount of time. As they meet, do they know that they're going to have to call another election, or is that a surprise to them?
They don't. Well, I think Hitler's goal, and he tells his delegates this, they meet before they go into the first meeting of the Reichstag, and they are going to make sure that this Reichstag is dysfunctional. They're going to gridlock it with their 37%.
All right. And now, surprising to me is that the president of the Reichstag, sitting in the high seat over this vast room, is Hermann Göring. What is Hermann Göring's reputation at this point? And is he one of the Hitlerites? Is he somewhere in between Hitler and Prussia? How does Germany think of Hermann Göring? We know him as something of a buffoon in tailored uniforms. We don't know him as a hero.
Yeah. Hermann Göring was at that point a war hero. He had been a flying ace during the First World War. We know Baron von Richthofen's famous flying circus. Göring had actually, after Richthofen had died, Göring had taken over the flying circus, had won the Blue Max, which is, simply the highest military honor you could have. So he had a distinguished military career. He was well connected in the elite circles in Germany. he did work closely with Hitler. He was one of Hitler's closest lieutenants. But in terms of social standing, I mean, you have here Hermann Göring, this eminent, relatively eminent figure, working with this former Austrian, this Austrian corporal, and fanatic. So Göring played a very important role and you could say, was a man of distinction. He was a distinguished gentleman at that time.
And his status in Berlin was way above Hitler's. You present Hitler moving between Munich and Berlin, and we'll mention the Brown House is in Munich. That was the headquarters of the Nazi Party at this point, as they went from 19 to 6 million, whatever their number is, 13 million. And a secret to the SA that Tim reveals is they paid them. This is the Depression. And a little bit of money in a brown shirt went a long way for self-esteem throughout Germany. But the Brown House in Munich was their headquarters. They also came back and forth to Berlin. I think it's the Hotel Kaiserhof, which is Hitler's headquarters in apartment in Berlin at the end of Wilhelmstrasse. So Göring moves easily in the Berlin circles, but Hitler would strike me as a man who was awkward around the royalty. Is that correct?
I think by then, yeah, I mean, Hitler never felt completely at ease, but I think he brought a belligerence and a determination. He was out to destroy these people. So when he was in there, he never acted as if he was intimidated by them. There was a defiance. There was a belligerence to it. You mentioned the Hotel Kaiserhof. The important thing about that, and that was in the Wilhelmstrasse, it was literally across the street from the Reichschancellor. So Hitler could look out his window and see the Reichschancellor. And I think that choice of location was a clear expression of Hitler's intent, his ultimate intent.
The Reichstag is dissolved by order. The new election is called for November 6th. And when we come back, Hitler über Deutschland again. The book is Takeover, Hitler's Final Rise to Power. Timothy Ryback is the author. Hitler has used an airplane before in the campaign against Hindenburg for the presidency earlier in the year of 32, but now he hires another plane to fly around Germany. And Tim provides a quote, "Let the battle begin." Hitler sees himself as a contesting for victory. In 4 weeks, he predicts on October 6th, we will be victorious. What is that airplane for? How does he campaign, Tim?
Hitler was certainly the first German political figure to use an airplane, possibly the first figure in Europe. What happened was Hitler did not have access to radio the way other people could and reach millions. He's basically banned from the airwaves. So he had to look for alternate ways of reaching the people. I should also mention, he also in the mainstream press, he was basically cut out, was not getting his message through. So he did a couple of things. He used whatever technology could. They produced these little vinyl records with Hitler giving speeches that were distributed by the tens of thousands to get word out there. But most importantly, as you mentioned, John, he leased a Lufthansa passenger plane, and he did this actually early in 1932 for the presidential elections. And he started, instead of taking a train or taking a car and visiting one or two places a day, with an airplane, he was visiting up to 6 locations a day. And Hitler crisscrossed Germany, went to dozens and dozens of places, was landing, there are accounts of him landing in farmers' fields and walking into villages and meeting people. And the truth is, it was Hitler's way of reaching heartland Germany, and this was really sort of the man of the people. Yeah, he was in villages that most Berlin politicians had never even heard of. And so his outreach and his impact was through the use of the airplane was really exceptional and impactful.
During the course of this campaign, these 4 weeks, he mocks a man named Hugenberg, and we best introduce the press lord of Germany. He says, Hugenberg says, give in. A smart person says, will give in and become a member of the coalition. 9-9, says Hitler. I'd rather be a stupid man. Who is Hugenberg? Everybody in the audience knows who he is. We need to know who he is, Tim.
Hugenberg is probably the most consequential unknown figure for most people looking at this time period. Hugenberg was a media magnate. He controlled basically 1,600 newspapers across the country, was very conservative, was a wealthy man, and he was the one individual who truly had the power to make or break Hitler and would not stand down. Hitler could browbeat people, he could threaten people, and people would back off their confrontation. But let's say, aside from Hindenburg, Hugenberg was the one person who never stepped down in front of Hitler, and Hitler knew he needed Hugenberg.
And he mocks him in his speeches, but he does need him. And Hugenberg has the same prejudices that Hitler evidences. He's anti-Semitic, he's anti-Versailles, he's just you name it, because he's a man who is destructive and sees himself as a leader of the economy, which he emphasizes is far more important than this foolishness about order in the streets. To give you a taste of Hitler campaigning, he flies to Berlin on November 2nd, and he speaks at the Sportplatz, which is the big outdoor stadium. You've probably seen videos of him speaking there. And Tim provides us translated quotes. When Papen says, Hitler's referring to the previous chancellor, Papen, when Papen says, I have the power, then I must answer 9-9. When Papen says the police and the army have power, no, the police and the army, they are not power, they are violence. The power lies with the people, in the faith of the people. This is Hitler. And Tim, you make a very important point several times in your book. What I just read is empty language. Anybody could say it. Why was it successful?
I think Hitler, with that kind of rhetoric, was successful because keep in mind, we're talking about post-1929 stock market crash. Germany is in terrible economic situations. The mainstream political leadership is failing the average German. And at the same time, you have this Bolshevik threat. And, we talk about the Nazis gaining votes. Well, you also have the communists doing the same thing. And the people in the center do fear the Bolsheviks. They've lost faith in the political establishment, and Hitler is simply offering them an alternative.
So the emptiness of the language, you've made this point in your book. I'm wrong to point to that as a weakness. I'm wrong to mock it. That isn't what the people were hearing when he spoke. You mentioned how he has this style of raising his voice very, very boldly, angrily, and then dropping it down to conversational level. How did that work?
Well, that was, Hitler did know, he was an astonishing orator. He knew how to work a crowd. He knew how to read a crowd, when to come in, how long to make people wait, how to appear. He would take a couple of basic tropes that he would, beat the same drum again and again and again. And he was talking, directly to the people. Was hitting them at an emotional level, but also beating certain themes, and that in particular was, the injustices of the Treaty of Versailles, the war guilt, the clause, the reparations, and the average. It was speaking to the average German who, at that point, many of them were in desperate circumstances, and did have nowhere to turn.
We come to the day of the vote, November 6th. And by 6 p.m. that night, as the polls are closing, Goebbels makes a note in his diary. Every hour is another defeat. It's a disaster. This is a complete surprise to anyone who hasn't followed as closely as you have, Tim, these months. Hitler's defeated. He's rejected by the German people on November 6th. He loses millions of votes compared to July 31st. Is there an explanation? Where did the voters go? Why did they turn away from him?
He did lose 2 million votes in it. It was a stunning defeat. Hitler was considered washed up. One commentator, my favorite one, was, Hitler is a man with a great future behind him. He was basically, as they say, seen as washed up. What had happened was this high water mark that he'd reached in the July 1932 elections. Hitler had been hinting that he might be willing to enter into a coalition, even though he never intended to. I think what happened was, when the people were willing to vote for Hitler, when they thought he was going to bring stability and a conservative government in place, when he refused to join a coalition government and Hindenburg sent him off, sent him marching. I think a lot of people just gave up on him and started going to other parties.
The book is Takeover, Hitler's Final Rise to Power. Timothy Ryback is the author. Tim is the co-founder and director of the Institute for Historical Justice and Reconciliation in The Hague. He speaks to me from Berlin. Hitler has been defeated. On November 6th, the German people have turned their backs on him. Compared to the gains of July 31st, when he had 37% of the Reichstag, he's been set back 2 million votes in the vote of November 6th. The whole party is discouraged. Goebbels is grim in his diary, but not Hitler. Hitler is always looking to make the best out of anything. He's never discouraged. He's driven. On the 14th, more than a week later, Hitler gets a call from von Papen, the previous chancellor, who is a man that Hitler has mocked repeatedly as a man who only knows about monocles. He calls him the cabinet of fun, the Baron's cabinet. All Germany calls him the cabinet. He's a man, as Tim has reminded us, who Schleicher, his master, said the reason he has a head or brains is to put a top hat on it, not to use them to think. But Papen calls Hitler. So, Tim, your wonderful story now gets extremely like a drawing room melodrama. Why does Papen call Hitler after the election?
I guess in German politics, maybe in all politics, everybody smells blood. What happens is, as you mentioned, John, Hitler disparaged Papen. Papen disparaged Hitler. The two men despised each other, disdained each other. But after the election, Papen calls Hitler because he knows the Nazis have lost 2 million votes. And he thinks maybe Hitler has softened up. Papen himself remains to this day the most unpopular chancellor in German history. Papen is head of government, Hindenburg is president, and Hindenburg is basically saying to Papen, I want a coalition government, I want a functioning Reichstag, get this thing in order. Well, the only way Papen can make this happen is even though Hitler is weakened, he's no longer 37%, they're down to 32, 34%, still the largest political faction in the Reichstag. Papen needs Hitler. So he writes, he's in touch with Hitler. He sends this letter basically saying, let's make up, let's leave this under, it's water under the bridge. Let's start working together. And Hitler writes this amazing letter back to Papen saying, I have been called so many names. I've been insulted and humiliated so many times that I never take these things personally. But he said, what I cannot bear is to watch you as chancellor squandering all the the goodwill of the German people, the faith they have put in the government, and everything that you're ruining. And he said, I will not, basically, I'll have nothing to do with you. Hitler smells blood. He knows Papen is in trouble because Papen is accountable to Hindenburg, and Hitler is not going to let Papen succeed.
On the 19th, Hindenburg sends for Hitler, and they meet again the second time. And this is a very difficult scene to discern because it ends with a smile on Hindenburg's face. Why? What in that meeting does Hindenburg want? What does Hitler want? And how does Hindenburg apparently win the moment?
Well, once again, it's Hindenburg calling this man in to see what might be possible and what not. And it actually begins in a fairly positive thing. Hindenburg wants this unter vier Augen, meaning just between the two of them. And the two of them apparently swap war stories. They have this exchange. It seems very congenial until it comes once again back to what is good for Germany versus what is good for Hitler. And, will Hitler put aside what is best for him personally for the sake of the country at large? And as always, it goes absolutely nowhere. The expectations had been very high in July, and the thing went bust. Once again, this one is another one where it just goes bust. And there was a fellow journalist like you, John, had been there observing, and it was an American, I think, maybe it was with CBS. In any event, he says, it's fun here, watching old Hindi lure Hitler into his trap and knocking him out again. And it just became almost this farcical thing with, Hitler's never going to make it. And this is basically when it comes up, Hitler as a man with a great future behind him. The guy just is not going to be able to function in a government. And it's, as the game is up, basically.
In the days before polling, I learned from Tim, they used local elections or state elections to judge how parties were doing nationally. And there's an election December 4th in Thuringia, which is a state of Germany. And so Hitler and the NSDAP throw their resources it's in the Weimar part of Germany. They stay at the Hotel Elephant, and Hitler starts campaigning again for the vote on December 4th. Remember, Hitler doesn't have access to radio. He's banned from that because Hindenburg has the power to ban him. And at one point, Hitler is beckoned to Berlin to meet with, is it Schleicher they want to meet? Or yes, it's Schleicher wants to meet with him. And he gets on the night train, and this is the famous underwear scene. All of a sudden we move into something that Charlie Chaplin, if he'd had this, he would have staged it in The Great Dictator. Hitler's on the night train asleep, and it stops in Jena on the way to Berlin. and there's pounding on his door. Tim, take over the scene.
Okay, well, there's a tension in the Nazi party. Strasser wants Hitler to enter into a coalition government. The hardliners, Joseph Goebbels and Röhm, Göring, want Hitler to continue to stonewall on this, to create a crisis. Hitler was actually in Munich. He takes the overnight train. He's supposed to meet Schleicher in Berlin that morning. At 5 o'clock in the morning or so, outside, when the train stops in Jena, there's a knock on his door. And Göring is standing there and says, "Get out." And Hitler allegedly, well, not like Hitler, we know Hitler exits the train and he goes into a meeting with Göring and Goebbels in Weimar, and the train continues sans Hitler, so without Hitler, up to Berlin, where Strasser was waiting for him. This was known as the Hitler's underwear scene, because of the way it was depicted in cartoons. Is Hitler was pulled out of his cabin in the morning, still in his nightshirt with his bare legs, with his prickly hair sticking out. I mean, it's an absolutely absurd scene. Normally, you would want to quash something like that, but it's one of these things where Hitler doubling down, the Nazi press actually picked up on this and denied all of this repeatedly, which only amplified this thing. But it was really this it illustrated, I think, in the most graphic way possible, the tensions, and the most humorous way possible, the tensions within the party, but also Hitler's waffling. I mean, here's this allegedly, man of authority, but suddenly being pulled between these various factions of his own party.
Strasser's wants coalition and conciliation. Goebbels wants power, only power, and that's the end of democracy. The book is Takeover, Hitler's Final Rise to Power. Timothy Ryback is the author. Again, Hitler is turned back. The Nazis are turned back. Thuringia, the vote that substitutes for polling, shows the NSDAP losing 25% of its previous vote in the previous election in November. Another humiliation. There's one more chance that we go through the winter holidays, Christmas holidays. Hitler, pretty much with his widowed older sister in Salzburg, the Berchtesgaden of fame of the war. Remember, these are hustling figures. These are not world-scale monsters. They have simple lives when they're not conniving with each other. It's Christmas time, and Hitler doesn't have a family. A little detail, he gets a book from somebody as a gift. There's no mention of a Christmas tree. Perhaps there is. Perhaps his sister keeps one for him, but he's a man without a family. He's peculiar. No psychology here. He's peculiar. There's a vote in Lippe, which is a very small state of 160,000 in the middle of January. What is their hope, Tim? Why do they throw their resources into Lippe? What's happened?
Well, okay. Their high water mark was 37% in the July elections. They take a hit of 2 million votes in the November elections. John, you mentioned the Thuringia vote, where they lose 25% again. So they are, not only are they losing votes, there's a break with Strasser where they're hemorrhaging membership of the party. And most consequentially, they are millions and millions of Reichsmarks in debt. I mean, they have run all these elections in the course of 1932. One estimate put the Nazi party at 90 million Reichsmarks in debt, which would be hundreds of millions of dollars. So the party was basically bankrupt politically, financially, and also ideologically with the split. The Lippe vote, Hitler wanted to finally break that 51%. He didn't care where it was. He wanted to be able to say we've won a majority. In this little state of 160,000 voters, they fall short again. They don't make 51%. Hitler declares it an electoral triumph anyway. And they play that up as the revival of the party.
I have not emphasized enough that Schleicher is the mastermind. Schleicher runs a spy network. Schleicher knows everything. Schleicher is campaigning to be the dictator himself. It's very important to follow a man who's disappeared from history. He's murdered by the Nazis later on, but looking back at him at this moment, he's very powerful. And his measure of how to break up the NSDAP is Strasser. What does Strasser and Schleicher talk about? How are they representing their futures? Is Strasser decided to betray Hitler? What is his thinking at this moment, Tim, after the Lippe setback?
Well, this is what happened. While Hitler is in Lippe, trying to get as many of the 160,000 votes as possible, Strasser is actually up in Berlin negotiating with Schleicher and meeting with Hindenburg with the idea that he could become vice chancellor, that there could, and what Schleicher's looking to do is identifying these tensions within the party to basically break off the Strasser faction from the hardliner faction of Göring and Goebbels, and to simply break the party apart, and have him he is all Schleicher has positioned himself as chancellor at this point, but to be able to deliver a large enough faction of the National Socialist vote to be able to create a functioning coalition within a Reichstag.
There's a quote that Tim uses in his book. We talked about it before we started talking again. Christopher Isherwood's great quote. Christopher is kind. Isherwood was in Berlin during this Weimar period of excellent art. And the quote is, Papen visits Hindenburg. Hitler visits Papen. Hitler and Papen visit Schleicher. Hugenberg sees Hindenburg and finds he's out. In other words, it's a circle game. And the Schleichers and the Strassers are dancing around each other to try to get past Hitler, who is sometimes aware of this and sometimes not. But the party's at the edge of breaking up, and they need a push. And perhaps the push is coming at the end of January. At this point, if you were reading this as a work of fiction, you'd be certain that Strasser would win because he's got all the heroic dimensions that everybody in Germany can see. The NSDAP likes him a great deal. He's their hero. And Hindenburg tolerates him. He could see Schleicher, even though Strasser, as a chancellor someday, even though he's got these socialist instincts, he's not a communist. One detail, Tim, about Strasser. Does he leave behind a note or a diary? We have less than a minute, indicating that he was ready to, that his thoughts about betraying Hitler, did he ever write it down? We have less than a minute.
No, we don't have that. What we have are the memoirs of his brother Otto. Strasser himself was murdered in Night of the Long Knives. His brother Otto escaped and did write memoirs. So we do have that record, but that's from his brother's perspective. Strasser himself, we don't. No.
So we don't know if he reasoned that he was trying to save the party as opposed to take it over.
I think Strasser was trying to save the party. He had helped build this, and he was simply he wasn't trying to betray Hitler. He was trying to save the National Socialist movement.
It is now late January. Takeover, Hitler's final rise to power. Timothy Ryback is the author. It is January 28th, 1933, the new year. Berlin. There's a party tonight, a press party, a celebration of elitism. At the same time, there is intrigue on Wilhelmstrasse because Strasser is being romanced by Schleicher and Hindenburg. Hitler is concerned that he's being iced out or elbowed out, but none of that is true because Schleicher has a plan that is going to solve everybody's difficulty and elbow them out of the way. Schleicher, remember, he's Minister of Defense, or at least he believes he is, and he goes to Hindenburg to confront Hindenburg with his choices. Tim, this is the best scene that I never knew existed. All I ever had, all those years of reading about January 33, is for reasons that were not explained, Hindenburg offered the chancellorship to Hitler, and that was the end of democracy. That was the end of peace in Europe. The meeting between Schleicher and Hindenburg is far more profound to explain what's going on. What does Schleicher want at this point? What does he tell Hindenburg his options are?
What Schleicher had manipulated the situation, first brought Papen into power as his puppet. Then when he saw this was in the spring of 32, when he saw the opportunity to remove Papen and replace Papen with himself, he did this in December of 32. So suddenly Schleicher finds himself both as Minister of Defense and as Chancellor, so head of the military and head of the government, simply after the president, the most powerful man in the country with all the key levers of power. But what Hindenburg still wants is a functioning Reichstag. He wants this is a constitutional democracy, constitutional republic. He simply wants the country to follow the rules. And so he needs to get a Reichstag put together. What Schleicher says to the president is, we need more time he had tried to negotiate with Hitler. You talked about these runarounds. What Schleicher was hoping to do was to build a coalition large enough in the Reichstag that you could begin ruling, get legislative processes going again, and reestablish democracy. He realized it was impossible. Hitler was not going to buy into it. He thought maybe he could do this with Strasser. That wasn't going to work. So he goes into Hindenburg and he says, you know what, I think I need 6 months basically of essentially martial law to let things settle down. The Nazi party is on the, he knows it's disintegrating, it's in trouble. So he's asking simply for 6 months or so for the political situation to stabilize and then resume normal democratic processes. This is essentially what Papen had proposed in December. And Hindenburg gets pretty irritated with him because Hindenburg had actually liked Papen. And he said, well, why couldn't we have done this with Papen and spared ourselves all the trauma of the last 6 weeks or 2 months or so? And he basically dismisses Schleicher as chancellor. He says, unacceptable. And Schleicher basically is dismissed.
Schleicher offers 3 options, as I understand. If I have them correct, Schleicher offers Papen is a possibility for chancellorship, but he would be laughed at. He did a poor job before. There's Hitler for chancellorship, and that's unacceptable because Hitler is completely out of control. And the third option would be me, Schleicher, as chancellor. And Hindenburg has it right in front of him to say, all right, I will give it to you. Now, a detail. Earlier that day, Hindenburg, for casual reading, read a newspaper that's under Schleicher's control. And in that newspaper is someone using Schleicher's information to say, these are the 3 options that are going to be offered to Hindenburg, and he's going to choose Schleicher. That seems unbelievable, Tim.
And this is Hindenburg, as I say, does not like to be told what to do. He sees this as a threat,
Yeah.
and he is, yeah, irritated beyond all
He
measure.
fires Schleicher. He
And
fires.
he's fire Schleicher, yeah. And the press has a heyday with this naturally. Um, and now keep in mind, we've had it within 8 months, you've had three chancellors, basically appointed and dismissed. One newspaper said, at this rate, every German citizen is going to have an opportunity to be chancellor.
However, Schleicher is not a man who's defeated merely because he's been fired. There's a man named Hammerstein. He's head of the Reichswehr. That's the Wehrmacht before it became Hitler's army. The Reichswehr has the troops, has the barracks, has the power, has the training to intervene in some fashion. So Schleicher is still, in his mind, Minister of Defense. And this is a drama that goes on between the 28th. The night of the 28th is this great big ball. All the women in their gowns and the men in their monocles gathering together to gossip about what happened today between Hindenburg and Schleicher. I can imagine the room voting for Schleicher in some fashion because he's one of them. But Hindenburg has this magical power over all of them. So there's a coup being planned. Is it on the night of the 28th? They're putting it together. Schleicher to Hammerstein. What does he want to happen?
Well, Hammerstein, as you said, is head of the military. More importantly, he despises Hitler and the Nazis. He's really an old school military man. And he understands that he has the ability to fire on the Nazis if there is any kind of Nazi revolt. But he goes in, he marches in the late at night into Hindenburg's office, and it's really an incredible scene. And he says, this is very unsettling for the army to have Schleicher, who's very popular, suddenly dismissed. Hindenburg once again sees this as no one's going to tell Hindenburg what to do. And he basically tells Hammerstein to get back to the garrison and mind his own business. Hindenburg knows how to handle things. Don't tell me how to run my country or my business. And as I said, sends him marching off.
Hindenburg does
But
call Blumberg, and we need to introduce Blumberg because he will be Hitler's chief of staff of the army until he's dismissed in disgrace. Blumberg has an assignment outside of Berlin. This is also another Prussian who survived the First War. And suddenly he's beckoned to Hindenburg's office and he thinks maybe he's done something wrong. What does Hindenburg want from Blumberg?
yeah, Blumberg is in Geneva sort of renegotiating in terms of the Treaty of Versailles, and he gets this call and he says, get back to Berlin. He has no idea what he's being called back for. He arrives on an overnight train. He gets taken into Hindenburg's office, and Hindenburg says, you're the new Minister of Defense. There isn't even a government at this point, but is suddenly finds himself as Minister of Defense. And then, well, we know what follows after later that day.
And I take it that's the moment when Hindenburg is taking complete control of the government. And just to make a point here, Tim, about my reading of Hindenburg, he's far more manipulative and far more stubborn than I remembered being told before. Was this an opinion of Hindenburg at the time, or is it developed because we have access to better research about him intervening, manipulating, moving people around? He out-Schleichers Schleicher. Did they know that in the 30s?
They, Hindenburg is a complicated figure. Hindenburg is either this man, this monarch, this closet monarchist who wants democracy to be destroyed to bring to reestablish the old Kaiserreich. Or he's this man who's there for the good of the country. He does what he's told when he was in the army, when he was under the Kaiser, he did what he was told. When he's elected president of a democratic republic, a constitutional republic, he's going to follow the rules. And people have said that he read the Constitution. He followed the Constitution the way a field officer would follow a field manual. So he was trying to read it to the letter. And I think Hindenburg is complicated. I personally, John, feel that Hindenburg was trying to do whatever was best for the German nation at large. He was conservative. He was a monarchist at heart, but he was doing his duty, putting Germany above all else at the end of the day. And I think where he did begin to stumble, maybe he just wearied. Schleicher referred to himself as the last horse in Hindenburg's stall. I think Hindenburg found he had exhausted all of his options. I do think that the man was 84 years old. He was weary. And I think he made some unfortunate decisions. And we ended up where we ended up with on January 30th.
Yes, he says to Papen, "You mean I have the unpleasant task of appointing decent Hitler as the next chancellor?" And Papen shakes his head yes. When we come back, January 30th, the book is Takeover, Hitler's Final Rise to Power. Timothy Ryback is the author. We're now January 30th on Wilhelmstrasse, and Hindenburg is sent for Hitler. It's 9:40 in the morning. Tim is very detailed about this. When Hitler's Mercedes calls for him to take him to the meeting with Hindenburg, Hitler believes that he will now be made chancellor. However, he needs a majority, and he doesn't have it. So he needs a man named Hugenberg, and we talked about before. And Hugenberg is aware that he has to be part of this coalition and defer in some fashion to Hitler, but he's reluctant. Tim, this is a scene that you want to rewrite many times. What is Hugenberg's thinking that morning? Can he keep this from happening? Does he want more for joining the coalition? What are his thoughts?
Well, Hugenberg has waited his entire career to be part of government. He sees himself as the potential being Minister of Economics. He's a businessman. It's a tremendous opportunity. He also knows that he's the one man with the power to make or break Adolf Hitler at that moment. Why? In the November 6th election, he ended up with 1 million votes that Hitler had lost, which means Hugenberg had 40 seats in the Reichstag. Now, it's not a large number in 600-seat Reichstag, but it's a vital part of a coalition that Hitler needs for Hindenburg to agree to appoint Hitler chancellor. So without Hugenberg, Hitler is not going to be chancellor. Now, the problem these two guys fight always. They do not, their politics are identical. They are anti-Semitic. They want the destruction of Germany. They're both power hungry. But what Hitler wants is to hold new Reichstag elections as soon as he's chancellor in order to create a majority. This is the famous March 1933 election. Hugenberg, it's the last thing Hugenberg wants. He got his 40 seats. He knows he will never get a larger percentage, but he has that power. So the last thing he wants is a is another Reichstag election. Now, Papen has been behind the scenes all of January negotiating between Hugenberg and Hitler and going to Hindenburg to sort of say, I think I'm putting this deal together. So they arrive there on the morning of January 30th. They think everything is set. What Papen has slightly fudged is the fact that Hitler is demanding new Reichstag elections and that Hugenberg absolutely refuses to join any government. So they get in the room, they're standing outside Hindenburg's office. And all of a sudden, this issue of Reichstag elections comes up. And Hugenberg says, wait, what are you talking about? We aren't having new elections. And Hitler says, well, yes, we are. Hugenberg says, not with me. And suddenly they go into crisis mode. Meanwhile, Hindenburg is sitting there, looking at his watch, saying, where are these gentlemen? They're down there negotiating this thing. And Hindenburg is, he had to hold his nose to appoint Hitler chancellor. It's the last thing he wants to do. He's been forced into it by circumstances. But he's ready to sort of pick up his cane and walk out. And finally, at one point, all these guys, Göring and Papen and Hitler, they corner Hugenberg and they say, look, we do Reichstag, we'll work it out later. Just let's go. And Hugenberg goes, nine, and he refuses. Finally, they get they get an edge in there where it's sort of, he waffles a bit. And so he said, okay, let's go. And they march up the stairs into Hindenburg's office, and the deal is done. And it's all really, as you said, it's like it's either out of a comedy or a tragedy, but you can't make this stuff up.
You have a photograph in your book. It's a photograph that needs interpretation for the ages. Hitler's in the middle. There are three chairs. Hitler's sitting. All the cabinets behind him. Hugenberg is off to the left. Behind Papen. Papen looks like an English gentleman on the weekends. Hitler's in the middle, and Göring has a smile on his face turning towards Hitler. Their shoes are scuffed. Behind them are members of the cabinet. Hitler looks completely out of place. He has a haircut that's suggestive of either the trenches or some kind of tough boy. The sides are completely trimmed back and then the shock of black hair thrown over the top. Hitler looks angry. To me, Tim, does he look angry to you?
Yeah.
And Göring looks like he's won the party cake. He's smiling generously. Hugenberg looks stunned, as if he's looking. I couldn't tell because you introduced Hugenberg. I figured he was something of a frog, but this looks like a man who's just made, as you write in your book, the biggest mistake of his life. We have 30 seconds. What happens to Schleicher the next year?
So the deal is done. As you said, John, Hugenberg says the next morning, I just made the biggest mistake of my life. By June of 1934, this is the night of the long knives, Schleicher has been murdered, Strasser has been murdered, Röhm has been murdered, and dozens and dozens of others. And that's really sort of the final moment for what we now known as Hitler's seizure of power.
Right. The monsters themselves come out after this. The book is Takeover. I highly recommend it. These are details that tell the story of how hustlers become monsters. Hitler's final rise to power. Timothy Ryback is the author. I'm John Batchelor.